chat box. So in the interest of time then, let's begin. Our first speaker is Kevin Ofoegbune. Kevin is a Nigerian-Canadian writer, scholar, and educator based in Toronto, Ontario. He created, produces, and hosts Flavors of Africa, which airs on Omni Television. He is a PhD candidate at OISE and is exploring the relationship between parenting and academic successes and struggles in the lives of second-generation African men in Canada. The title of Kevin's paper is Africanish, Examining the Parentage and Academic Success of Second-Generation African Males in Canada. Welcome, Kevin, and we look forward to your talk for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Larkin. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Women and Gender Studies Institute of U of T. Thank you, Graduate Students Union. And I thank all the leaders that I've already heard from and all the leaders that are present. It's quite an honor to be here. I am just starting this journey. I feel like I would just say I'm just starting it. Having been in my PhD for 3 years now from the Master of Teaching program at OISE. So in my focus with the Master of Teaching program, I looked at students within the education system. Primarily, I took a gendered approach and I was examining the lived experiences and education trajectories of Black male students, specifically in Toronto. And I was looking at various things such as the implementation of Afrocentric learning in the curriculum. I explored different perspectives on teacher bias and also the strength in which manifests in the Black community. And so it's in that spirit of strength, and it is in that spirit of speaking to power as well, that I've carried on my research in my PhD. But primarily now, I am exploring the ways in which Black men, despite structural barriers, despite discourses of systemic racism, are able to succeed within the school system and are able to do that through parenting, through fathering, through mothering. And it's also within this lens that, you know, I ground myself specifically even towards gender in thinking about my father, and also in thinking about my mother too, and the role that they played in my academic growth and my academic strengths, and how they've helped me to overcome the obstacles that are presented to me. So with that being said, I think of the importance of even starting with African proverbs, that it takes a village to raise a child. Whether the village these days is the new African diaspora, and whether we are taking an active role in raising our children and empowering them to see themselves as worthy as students, despite violences or obstacles that may occur in the education system. This concept is very important. And I also think of the wisdoms that are passed down from my ancestors to me, from my great-grandmother to my grandmother to my mother and father, who always have the African proverb of Ebe Belu, Ugwe Belu, which means let the kite perch and let the eagle perch. So let everybody be also celebrated for their strengths, as we all have our own path, despite belonging to a group as well. So in thinking about my connection to this specific seminar, I ground my research in the concept of, or the theory of intersectionality, which comes from Black feminist thought. So I honor that perspective from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And I think about the importance of Black mothers too in this project as enemies of the state that often resist the systemic violence that their children experience in the school system. So once again, my study is rooted in intersectionality. And it also disrupts, and by using intersectionality, I also disrupt the notion of the Black community or Black communities as monolithic, in that I'm bringing in the perspective of Africans in the new diaspora that have been traditionally understudied. So I'm specifically looking at Nigerian men, Kenyan men, and Ghanaian men. And I'm exploring their lived experiences, which is often not performed in research. And I'm looking at the ways in which they still achieve what we would call academic success, despite what we typically hear about Black male students and Black men. And then I'm looking at what does all this mean? And so what are the impacts? If we have success in the Black community in ways that we're said not to, does this mean that we can take this success and build transformative societies? So that's what I'm also exploring. And I'm looking at the ways too in which Africans are further othered within the Black community. So we have, discussions, especially in terms of Black histories, we often connect our histories to the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm exploring what that means for Africans that come to this land that has been colonized, that originally belonged to the indigenous people. So how do they experience their identities and how do they take on Blackness? And in turn, how do they impart their own values and their own experiences? How do their own experiences shape how their children come to view their own Blackness and negotiate their identities? And I'm also exploring the ways in which identity, class, spiritualities, and gender and language play a role in the identities of Black men in the new African diaspora who also experience gendered racialization. So essentially in doing that, I asked the main question with my research question is, how are the successes and struggles of Black men who are second generation peoples of the new African diaspora? How are those successes influenced by the parental practices of their parents and or guardians who have socialized them? And so in conducting my research so far, what I have come to know or to understand is that in terms of academic success for their children, Ghanaian, Kenyan, and Nigerian families do contain some privilege, a great degree of privilege that enables them to empower their children. Having a connection to the land and having the connection to their continent and not having their cultures ruptured per se. For instance, my parents grew up in Nigeria, which is considerably a Black nation, a Black African country where they were not racialized. And so I look at that and I see how their experiences have shaped my views of myself as a Black man, being proud of my culture, being proud of my heritage too, and having that grounding. So I'm looking at that. I'm looking also at the fact of, the differences between the education systems of various parents. So, the experiences too of my parents and their academic experiences have shaped my own academic experiences. And so I speak to various events, such as my mother growing up and having grown up in a mud house and being told through colonial education that the mud house was actually substandard and that it was European homes that should be valued. And so she learned that through her colonial education that was imposed on her in Nigeria after the independence. And so, with that view, she informed her parents that they should acquire a home that is more European in nature. And I find that, and then the community sort of started to shift as well as more of these homes sprung up. So I feel that it was from these values that were imparted in my mother's education that have also influenced me. And so I even think of my journey, would I be here if they didn't receive this colonial education? And so, of course, I'm also noticing along my journey that insufficient research has been conducted within the new African diaspora. So I'm exploring what this erasure means for the new African diaspora and what new learnings can help to disrupt various notions that are out there, such as not having empowerment within our own communities, not having privilege, and then learning what it means that if we do have privilege, what does that mean in order for us to overcome certain barriers, in order for us to overcome the way in which we look at policy that might be blindsiding us and looking at at those learnings. And then I also take into consideration that Africans experience hardships as well. Coming to the new African diaspora, they often have to support their new families at the same time. They do experience culture shock, especially gender becomes problematic in many new African diasporic families because there's a great degree of role reversal. So whereas Black men adhere to a type of African patriarchy, that is lessened when they come to Canada or when they come to the United States, because oftentimes African women become the breadwinners. So I'm also looking at those complexities and also what it means to always have traditionally the nuclear family. And so to have a home that is spearheaded by two individuals. And as well, I'm looking at the ways in which Black North American masculinities and African masculinities diverge. I'm exploring the ways in which students or young Black men experience those type of role strains. So they experience having to negotiate their Blackness and having to negotiate their Africanness and being accepted by their peers, but then also being comfortable to express themselves to their parents if they adopt Black North American masculinity as opposed to African masculinity as well. And I'm also continuing to look at the negotiation of Africanness. So exploring the ways in which our African identities, again, have influenced our success or have influenced our struggles in the new African diaspora. Oftentimes when Nigerian students or Nigerian young people feel that they're not academically successful, they will tend to neglect parts of their African identity. So that's what I'm exploring, and I'm exploring it through a methodology that is still in line with Black feminist thought, in that I am taking a social justice perspective and I'm gaining the lived experiences and amplifying the voices of Black men through semi-structured interviews and focus groups. So I am taking this journey as a learner, really, as I continue to learn and continue to unlearn various practices.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin, for that very interesting paper. And apologies that my video was on during part of that talk. I was working on a technical issue here and trying to get it sorted out, but I think we have done that now. So once again, it was a very interesting paper. Thank you very much. We'll now move to our second speaker, Jessica Nogueira Varela. Jessica is first-year doctoral student from Brazil, enrolled in the Gender Studies Department at the Central European University, CEU. Jessica graduated as a Master of Arts student in 2020, and her main fields of interest are decolonial and post-colonial theory, Black feminism, critical race studies, migration studies, and Chicano feminism. The title of Jessica's paper is Fighting the Good Fight, or How Black Women Daily Resist and Oppose Negative Stereotypes in Europe. Welcome, Jessica. We look forward to your paper.
Hello, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're quite light.
On, yeah.
Jessica, can you please speak up? Because we have, yes, if you could please turn on your camera, if that's a possibility for you.
I think the camera is on and I'm trying to speak louder. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Okay,
yes, you can
great.
hear, but it's hard to hear.
All right. Okay. So I may have to speak very close to the. Okay. Is it better now? Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Fantastic. So I will, in this case, try to just make the volume louder here so I can hear you too better. Is it okay if I share my screen?
Yes, the technical team will make you a host, so you'll be able to share your screen. So Darlene and Sam, Darlene especially, depending on you to help Jessica.
I mean, it's okay if I can't. Just yeah, just wanted to ask. Yeah, okay, thank you. Fantastic. So I will start sharing my screen now, and I have a PowerPoint presentation that I would like to show everybody. Can you see the screen? Is it sharing? Okay, it will share now, I think. All right, I think it's sharing, huh?
Yes, we can see the presentation.
All right, perfect. That's great. Okay, so all right. Great. So thank you so much for the conference. It's a real pleasure and it's a real honor to be here, to be able to participate, to learn from people as Jackie Alexander herself, and to hear all of the different work that has been going on so far. My name is Jessica. I am a Brazilian student originally who's studying in Europe for about 2 years now. My preferred pronouns are she and her. And I would like to now start discussing a few points from my research and my presentation. So the first thing I'd like to do is just to introduce a few concepts. In my research, I'm trying to analyze the practices of resistance Black women, self-identified Black women exercise daily against colonial images in Europe. And I'm trying to understand what those images are, where do they come from, and how is it that Black women can oppose those images. So who are the Black women in the title that I am referring to, and where are they located? Well, my research was conducted from the year 2019 to 2020, so 1 year, in the city of Berlin. And I had the opportunity to speak to about 13 different Black women, self-identified Black women, European and non-European. I have decided to divide them in these two groups as I did not want to limit my research by thinking in terms of migrants versus non-migrants. And I really wanted to hear how they identify themselves. So I am considering self-identification or self-definition, as Audre Lorde would have it, and Patricia Hill Collins as well, as a key tool, a key practice of resistance in everyday life. And by resistance, what do I mean by that? I'm trying to consider practices that subvert power and that play with power, that tries to address practices of ordering in general. So as I said, I did fieldwork research. I am utilizing in this paper, Black Feminism Colonial Framework. This is based off of my MA research, which wanted to compare the differences and similarities between non-European Black women and European Black women. And I'm trying to understand how systematized oppression makes us feel like we are the surplus, as Audre Lorde suggests. And I'm considering as well coloniality, a form of rationality based on colonization and imperialism as systems of domination. I'm considering coloniality of gender specifically as a lens of analysis to understand the construction of bodily and linguistic differences in a hierarchical sense that makes some people be seen as more human than others. My main claims is that Black women in Europe challenge the idea of a colorblind and racially homogeneous Europe that could be largely untouched by the same racial ideology it exported all over the world. I'm taking this from Fatma El Tayeb in the book European Others. I think it's a very interesting way to work with the false idea that Europe exists in a homogeneous and peaceful space. And my second claim is that Black women's self-definition is a crucial element in combating those images, those controlling colonial images that are especially harmful against Black women migrants who may be financially vulnerable. So, coloniality of gender and controlling images. These are two like central concepts that I'm trying to approach. And Lugones is going to discuss how the female identified body is usually understood as inferior in relation to the human male identified body in Western patriarchal or heteronormative societies. And this is something that can be seen in the space of continental Europe as well as in other global South and global North countries. And I'm taking Lugon's understanding of how these racial lines, they will combine themselves through heterosexual and biological understanding of gender. So with that, I'm going to jump into the controlling images. So what are the controlling images that I'm referring to? The controlling images, they reproduce notions that essentialize Black people in general and Black women in particular, as it is the focus of my research. These controlling images, they come from the enslavement era, as Collins explains in Black feminist thought, and I'm tentatively dislocating this concept and trying to reframe it to the European context and understand it as a different space that thinks about Blackness in a different way than people do in the US or in Brazil, for instance, where Black people are seen as a problem that is a part of the country, that is a part of the nation's history. Whereas in Europe, in a more general sense, in the continent of Europe, Blackness is seen as outside. So Black people here tend to be seen as foreigners, eternal foreigners, no matter how many generations of their family may have been living here. And with that, I'm going to jump into the images that I want to discuss. So the first image is the one that is most related to the colonial concept of Black womanhood, which is the one that is literally a person from the jungle. So the person who's coming from some bushes, the Black woman that is questioned as to her ability, not only cognitive ability, but that is questioned as to her humanity, really. And so I have a quote from one of my interviewees saying that she remembers she used to cry and feel sad because people were looking down on her as if she could not do very simple things, and that she felt as though they were saying that she traveled from a time before civilization. And I combine this with Beto Quilombo's proposal that racism is not biological in itself, but discursive, that it works through a chain of words that trigger the imagination. So African, Africa, jungle, wild, primitive, inferior, animal, and monkey. And Quilombo is an Afro-Portuguese artist and writer that's going to also research Black womanhood in Europe. So the second point is that of objectification. And this one point was very mentioned by my interviewees. A lot of them talked about their experiences with sexual harassment and sexual violence. As you can see from the slide, the first person says that she often felt very disrespected at her work. That people usually expect Black women to be a bit more sensual, a bit more sexy, to be good and bad, and that men will feel that they can approach Black women at the workplace, on the streets, and in different spaces, and they will also assume that they are heterosexual, and say like very demeaning things to them and approach them in a way. And as you can see from there, there is also a comparison with Black womanhood in relation to white womanhood and what it means, like that Black women are not seen as equal or as beautiful or as interesting or as a person in general. And the last point is the point of, well, not the last, but the one before the last, regarding the construction also of sexuality and how the image of the non-heterosexual Black woman is simply unthinkable and not accepted, really. I have another quote from one of my interviewees, Isabel, who self-defined as a sapatão. And a sapatão is used to be a derogatory term in Brazil to refer to women who loved women or who love women. And Isabel was reclaiming the term as a means of existence, as a means of self-identifying in a world that tells her that she should not exist, that she's a thing and not a person. And then there's the last one, which is the hip hop dancer stereotype, which is not really that negative, but that people assume, for example, with the first quote that is from Wanda, that is originally from the UK and was living in Berlin. And she was telling me just about how people usually expected her to be the person that was taking the classes instead of teaching the classes. And that people would usually expect her to be a hip hop dancer, even though she was a classically trained dancer. And then there is another quote by another interviewee who said, I can be loud or a hip hop dancer because I can express myself how I want, but that does not define me. And to conclude, I will present very quickly some strategies of survival that can possibly speak to power. So strategy number 1 and 2 are mostly individual strategies that work on a micro scale. One is to become extremely self-aware and over-prepared and attentive, which has its own emotional and physical toll on the person that's trying to do that, but then that person will try to excel and to work twice as hard to be acknowledged as a professional and as a human being. And there is the person who turns the question back on the one who's committing microaggressions. So instead of directly answering that question, they will divert it, or they will try to ask that question back to the person who's committing the microaggression. And finally, we have self-definition, which is the way in which women, Black women, self-identify and critically think through their bodily realities and existences, which is not finished process, but a continuous one. And finally, through self-definition, it is possible to create communities, as I have seen many different communities when I was doing the research in Berlin, communities that go from kindergarten specialized in receiving children of color to communities of student unions, to communities that would be of young workers, to different communities that would organize around their self-definition and self-identification. And with that, I finish my presentation, and I thank you for your time and attention, and I'm looking forward to hearing the questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that very, very interesting paper. And, reminding us that we need to think about Blackness in different ways in different sites, and some very, very interesting thoughts there. I would now like to invite our third panelist to speak. Our final speaker is Vanbasten Araujo. Vanbasten is a Brazilian scholar doing his PhD at the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. His research interests are environmental studies, environmental policies in Brazil, feminist biopolitical theories, decolonial science and technology studies, and queer ecologies. Vanbasten's paper is titled, I Am Not a Gravedigger, Bolsonaro's Toxic Discourses Amidst the COVID-19 Pandemic. Welcome, Vanbasten, and we look forward to your paper.
Hi, sorry, I was trying to unmute. Okay, I would like to first say thank you to everyone who's here and watching, and to also point out that it's very nice to see people from Global South taking over these conferences and sharing different perspectives. So my paper is called I'm Not a Gravedigger, Bolsonaro's Toxic Discourse During the COVID-19 Pandemic. I want to first then settle some ground rules for the presentation, is kind of settle what are the concepts and the ways and that I'm reading the whole situation. So in matters of scale, this is going to be something focused mostly on discourses and public policy analysis of Bolsonaro's government in the context of Brazilian COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. The two main streams of thought that I'm engaging with, first of them is understanding masculinities, like hegemonic masculinities, toxic masculinities, in relation to Bolsonaro's public presence and leadership during the crisis. And the second one is more on the side of religion and politics, and how he uses religious sources as masculine references, and also how the support from the evangelical churches has also been used as a way to distrust science. So what are the solutions that he has been offering people, and also the distrust of science that comes from his discourses. So in all of this, we can see already that I use toxicity in many different fields and coming from many different directions. So I do see toxicity as a traveling concept that comes from chemistry and goes to literature and now comes from public discourses. So giving a bit of background of what's happening here right now. As of today, I took this data today in the morning. So as of today, we have more than 5 million cases and more than 152,000 deaths. Currently, we have very loose quarantine measures that were left to local governments to decide on what it's going to look like. And mostly they don't look like nothing because they don't exist. And the motto for Bolsonaro during this period has been the country cannot stop. And it is all about saving Brazil from an economic collapse that will come from people stopping to work, and mostly poor people going to do their services, but not people who can afford to work from home. But one interesting aspect of all of this is that Bolsonaro good evaluations rose to 40% before it was 29 in the beginning of the year. So we rose to 40% mostly because there is this emergency bursary in place, which is of 600 reais, approximately 140 Canadian dollars. And it has been helping a lot of people, especially those who lived under the poverty line. So he has been using a lot of these economic bursary things to kind of boost his team towards God forbids a re-election, but that's what is happening so far. I brought 4 quotes. I could have brought like 100 because he has been really talkative and saying a lot of very bad stuff, but I brought 4 of them because I think that they relate to the topic of the presentation. So the first one was said in March 29, and he said that this is our reality. The virus is here. We're going to have to face it, but face it like a fucking man, not like a kid. Let's face the virus with reality. This is life and we all will die someday. And then at the end of the following month, he said, as he was asked, President, today we have more than 300 deaths. How many deaths do you think? And then he interrupted the journalist to say, hey, I'm not a grave digger, okay? So, and that's where I take the title from. And then 8 days after that, he says, so what? I am sorry. What do you want me to do? I am Messiah, but I do not perform miracles. And now he's referring to his own name. His name is Jair Messias, which is Messiah. So he was saying that he's not God. Although he's Messiah, he's not God and he cannot do miracles. And then at the end, in the mid of May, he says that we must have the courage to face the virus. Are there people dying? Yes. Am I sorry? Yes, I'm sorry. But more people will die if the economy continues to be destroyed by these measures. And the measures were the very latent quarantine procedures that happened during the beginning of the pandemic here. So he was really all the way through focusing on economy, focusing on saving Brazil from collapse, and never focusing on the deaths, never focusing on class aspects or on racial aspects, on gender aspects. And also when gender comes in for him is through his assertion of his masculinity and his power as a man. So there is another quote that he says that he was an athlete when he was younger. So if he gets COVID, he wouldn't die because he's very good. He's an athlete. So here it comes to the part I was mentioning before, the toxic masculinity. So going back to the origins of the term, toxic masculinity was used in the 80s and 90s by this mythopoetic men's movement that was an outlet for men to embrace their masculinity and to act like a man because they were feeling pressured not to. And then in the 2010s, cultural studies and gender studies, they started seeing how the self-help concept from the 90s was coming back towards gender analysis of social relations. And they see and they describe it mostly as about dominance, self-reliance, competition, anger, and lack of empathy. All of those you can see in Bolsonaro's discourses and in how he's been dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. Then, for me, also in this paper, I'm considering toxic masculinity, as Cooper did in 2005, as the constellation of socially regressive masculine traits that serve to foster domination, the devaluation of women, homophobia, and wanton violence. And one thing that I want to specify here is that I do not put structural patriarchy in opposition to toxic masculinities, but I see them as dialectical and working together. So there is a structural patriarchy, and within that, we can also think of toxic masculinities as a very heightened degree of patriarchy that is structural, but that is different from general masculinity because it has a higher degree of violence. So because it purports violence, because it encourages violence in many levels. So I'm not saying that there is this inherited characteristics of men to be the bad ones, and I'm not also saying that there are those bad men, there are toxic, and there are those who are not. It's way more complex than that, and it is structural. So within this structure, there are different degrees of violence, and I put toxic masculinity on top. So now I turn to my other stream of theoretical work, which is eco-criticism and toxic discourses. And here I'm focusing more on how the literary work from the 1990s can help us think about toxicity. And what I'm trying to figure here is how toxicity forces us to return to life. So now when you think about toxicity, when you think about the pandemic, there's also like this discourse of, oh, I'm refiguring my life, I'm refiguring my purposes, I'm refiguring my priorities. So it really forces us to take a step back and rethink things. And there is this quote from Buell's text where he says that studies on contaminated communities made them think about how they were slow and reluctant in the beginning to see this toxic aspect of things, but then after they saw it, they were feeling outrage, acquiescence, impotence, and denial and desperation, which are all characteristics that I also see in the COVID-19 situation. So in the end, what I'm trying to suggest is that toxicity is already here. So there are cultural, political, social, and poetic significance of this metaphor of toxicity being used to analyze public policy, but also being used to analyze public presence, or also in the case of Bolsonaro and his discourses. So what I'm trying to point at is how matter and meaning are deeply entangled, as new materialist feminists would argue. So a construction of our word is not just a matter of how we communicate, but how this communication permeates the materiality of things and also enables some behaviors to happen. So I take 3 takeaways from all of these. Then the first one is that language matters, and I put the matters in bold because it literally matters. So what he says has material repercussions. So now we have more than 152,000 deaths. That's not only because of bad public policies, but also because of the repercussions of his discourses in people's behaviors. So it invokes and promotes similar forms of behaviors that are quite violent. So toxicity shapes the government of lives in Brazil. So I see toxicity then very much entangled with biopolitical frameworks, and that would separate then who are the ones that are important to maintain the country running, and who are those who can die in order to make the country run itself. And then the second one is this anti-science and the return of messianic politics. Although he says he's not the Messiah, he acts like he is. So there is this paradoxical and utilitarian relationship with science. So sometimes he refutes it and sometimes he references it, which creates then this space for other types of paradoxical information to work within. So for example, fake news right now in Brazil is a big thing because there is the space of always questioning things, because even the president is not straightforward with his policies and with what he thinks. And then also there is always this sense of urgency in all the time when he's talking about things. He's always very urgent in not leading the country to down the rabbit hole. So what I'm thinking is how urgency and this utilitarian use of anti-science is part of his messianic image. And then to finish, there is also the question of states' priorities and the citizenship trap. So the state prioritizes the economy and the rich population over the health and survival of poor communities. So the rights that are guaranteed by our Constitution from 1988, they are left aside in order to enable economic development. So where lies the priorities, and also where lies the understanding of the Brazilian jurisdiction over this emergency context that we're living in. So yes, that's what I brought today, and I think you'll like it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vanbasten, for that very, very interesting paper. And thanks to everyone for all three panelists, Kevin Ofoegbune, Jessica Nogueira Varela, and Vanbasten Araujo, for those interesting papers as a set of papers that look at gender from different sites around the world, from Central Europe, from Canada, from Brazil. So I think very interesting to think about notions of masculinity and femininity from those different sites. I was also a bit interested in what those papers had in common, and maybe we can talk about that at some time, at some point. But I do want to open it up now for questions. If there are any questions from participants. And I believe the moderator is here as well, am I right? Who can also pass questions on to me. And are there any questions? Feel free to put questions in the chat. So a question for Vanbasten. Thank you for your talk. My question is more about future utopia building or future looking. So what can replace the paradoxical messianic? How do we begin to detox from all the toxicity? Can you see that question, Vanbasten, as well?
Yes, yes, that's a good question and quite difficult. So I think that to replace this messianic discourse within Brazil, it's something that's going to take some time, because I think it's very ingrained into our politics. That's how it works. Like, we have had so many politicians who would act as messiahs to help our country to leave some very difficult position. So I think that it's very much part of how we see democracy working and citizenship working in Brazil. But a way out of that maybe would be to depersonalize politics in a way, because we are still very bounded to the representations and to specific people. So it's not just because of his political stances, it's because it is Bolsonaro. So we can have another right wing, as we do, another right wing person who says the same stuff he does, but they are not Bolsonaro. There's something else there that catches people's attention. And how do we begin to detox from this toxicity? I think that Detox is something that's not going to happen because we have already been implicated by toxicity in so many levels, materially and discursively. I think that we're now kind of like having to shift our frameworks to work within the trouble that we are already into, and then trying to see how to work through toxicity rather than trying to get back to a state where toxicity never happened, because there's also like this idea of returning to purity and what purity means, and being pure as also a state that is very desired by right-wing politicians. So we need to return to those roots. And I think that maybe we can actually work with the trouble, as Donna Haraway would say. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? Please feel free to put questions in the chat box or raise a question if anyone has one. Okay, and the moderator can send any questions to me that I might not be seeing. So let me just ask a question. This is kind of, I guess, a question that I'm putting to you as PhD students who are involved in the research dissertation process. And I'm going to sort of pose two questions, just because I think this is something, since we have many graduate students here, people are thinking about in terms of their own work. So you can answer one or both of these questions. And I think some of you talked about this a bit in your talks. What brought you to this research? Or in this research, have you had a particular challenge that you've had to overcome? And I'm just saying this for the benefit of those in the audience who are currently in the process of doing their own research. So I would invite the three of you to maybe think about that and respond. Kevin, do you have anything you'd like to say about either of those questions?
Yeah, those are very interesting questions, because I always reflect back and I think about those points that made me like embark on this journey. So I guess growing up as a racialized individual, you know, speaking about race or speaking even about culture, speaking about like, you know, the ways in which our community functions. I mean, these are new discussions that I'm having as an adult that I might not have had as a younger person. So when I lived in a racialized city like Calgary, I mean, my experiences of talking about race and talking about culture was very different compared to when I moved to Toronto, or when I felt more comfortable to address certain issues. So like I said, for me, it was looking at my studying to get my master's degree. And then that was when I felt more empowered to speak and more empowered to do research within the area of race and the lives of Black men, and exploring gendered racism and issues pertaining to. So what started to drive me where to was my own experiences, you know, where I started to think about, well, why don't we ever speak to, you know, Africans in the new African diaspora? Why are we only speaking about Black communities monolithically? Why aren't we talking about the differences within our own communities? Why aren't we talking about the strengths and the weaknesses? And so just through my own lived experiences have I felt the need to push this research further. And I think the obstacles that I'm facing really is the empowerment piece, whereby I do just challenge different notions of oppression, and I'm more focused on strengths. And so I think that is where I'm finding a challenge in speaking about my perspective, because I find that it's different in many regards. So.
Well, certainly the PhD process is always a reflective process. Most people experience as they go through it. So Jessica, anything you would like to add in terms of what brought you to this research, or challenges you have faced in the research and have worked to overcome?
Yeah, there were many challenges for sure, but what brought me to the topic of trying to understand Black womanhood was first my own thinking through identity, through self-identification. So how I came to understand myself as a Black woman coming from Brazil, which has such a complicated history of racial relations and colonialism. We have a lot of things that are still to be researched and understood. And so for me to come to the realization that I am a Black woman, that was one thing. And then the process of coming to Europe and realizing the way that I was racialized here was rather different than the way that I was racialized in Brazil. And although it had many similarities to, just was another thing that made me continuously question what it means to be Black in this world. And so I agree with Kevin that usually we are thinking and hearing about Blackness in ways that are very homogenous, but that's not really it. And so in trying to understand this diversity, that's what brought me to the research topic. But then, to be honest, in terms of challenges, my main challenge was actually trying to figure out how to do research as a Black woman coming from Brazil in Europe. And that means that I had to change my research topic, which before was concerning transnational Black feminism, and I had to adapt it to my conditions here, which were and are still rather limited. And with this pandemic, it's all the more complicated for everybody, obviously. So these, I would say, are challenges that I had to face over the course of the MA.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure with COVID, there are a number of students and all of us who do research that are facing challenges. So that I think is a common experience. I also think it's very interesting that, you know, you're from Brazil, and of course, Vanbasten is talking about masculinity in Brazil. So I think there's some conversations the two of you could be having as well. But Vanbasten, perhaps you could share some comments, if you would, about what brought you to this process. And then also some of the challenges or a challenge you've had in the research that you've worked to overcome.
Yes, this topic in specific, it relates to my PhD research, but it's not my PhD research per se. I'm doing research on endocrine disruptor agrochemicals and their impact to reproductive health of women in some areas in Brazil. But when I was doing this research on toxicity and the meanings of toxicity and how this toxicity travels through lands, bodies, and policies, and in many ways, I was seeing how all of these were parallel to what was being done and not done by the government during the pandemic. And for a start, I was during the beginning of the pandemic, I was in Europe, and then I had to move back. And all of this process of seeing firsthand how the pandemic is here in Brazil also made me think of how does this relate? How my theoretical framework in my other research relate to what's happening now? And also maybe what are the environmental impacts of COVID, or the other way around, how environmental impacts might have been the source of COVID if we choose to believe the narrative of the animal trafficking and the zoonotic disease, and how depletion of biosphere is creating is enabling those pandemics to happen in more constants. So yes, I think I was just going through how this theoretical framework was not only it was not singular for just this project, but it could be used for other things. And I wanted to challenge myself and do it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. So I think we are at time. So I would